Hey guys, hope you're having a great day today. My name is Dylan, and today we're going to be doing another step-by-step color grading tutorial in Final Cut Pro. Last time we did a color grading tutorial that was kind of a moody grade, and we focused on complementary colors, which is where you have a predominant color, usually where the skin tones lie, and then you have a contrasting color that helps that color pop. Today we're going to be focused on something that's called split complementary colors, where you have that predominant skin tone color, and then in the background you have some contrasting colors that match it on the color scale. So my hard drive broke. Yes, I know, very sad. All my footage is currently lost, but it's getting recovered. The reason I say this is because this shot is not mine. It is my buddy Troy's. I believe this was shot with the Blackmagic 6K in 12-bit. So we have a lot of color information to work with today, but we're going to, like I said, give it a split complementary color look, and we're gonna focus on kind of pink and red, a little bit seafoam green, and some teal. So this is log footage, obviously, shot on the Blackmagic 6K, and yes, you can edit Blackmagic RAW in Final Cut Pro. Color Finale creates something called Color Finale Transcoder, which will allow you to edit B-RAW in Final Cut Pro. So I will include the link to that in the description in case you guys are interested. We talked about last time how there are two ways that you can convert this to a Rec. 709 color space. I showed you how to add contrast and saturation by just using the color wheels, and then I also showed you how to add a custom LUT based on the camera that you shot the log footage with. However, there is another way that I just learned, which maybe you already know, that is pretty easy, but is not always useful. So if you click your footage and then go to your inspector window, and you click the information button right here, head down to basic, go to edit metadata view, and if you click the button called camera LUT, which I already have it clicked, but click this camera LUT, click OK. And then you go down to camera LUT here. It has built-in options that will convert your log footage to Rec. 709 color space based on the camera you shot the log footage with. So for us, it was Blackmagic Design 4K. But the issue I have with this is that you cannot control the mix for this built-in LUT. Whereas if I just add a custom LUT, which I am going to do, then you can control the mix for the Rec. 709 LUT. So let me show you how to do that. So I already downloaded a LUT for Blackmagic, and this is a little too much, you'll notice. So I'm gonna bring that down just a tad. Now, something to pay attention to when you add a LUT is the LUT blowing out any detail in your shot, whether that be in the shadows or the highlights, because potentially your shot could be shot pretty bright like this shot was, and the LUT maybe raises the overall exposure of your shot, which then blows out detail. So if I toggle this off and on and you look right in this area, you'll notice that this cuts out some of our detail in the shot, and we don't want that. And you might think, okay, well then I will just add another correction right after the LUT, and I'll just bring down like either the highlights or the global exposure. But you'll notice that does nothing. And that's because we need to adjust the shot before we add the LUT. So let me reset all of these. And actually, if I bring this before, this is now the first correction on our shot. And then if I bring down the overall image, it's going to bring back some of that detail again. And we can adjust. I know she's dark here. We'll adjust that later. But so I'm going to bring that down a little bit, bring some of that detail and the highlights back. And like I talked about last time, it's always important to bring up your scope. So press Command 7. And if you want to have kind of your own workspace for color grading, so when it comes time to color grade, you have scopes up, you have your color board up, and maybe you would want the viewing screen to be a little bit larger, then we can create our own workspace. If you don't know how to do this or you don't have this set up, let me show you real quick. So get everything set up. I don't want my RGB parade up. I'll put up my RGB overlay, my Vectorscope, and my Luma Waveform. And then I'm gonna go to Window, to Workspaces, to Save Workspace As, and I'm gonna save it as Color Grading Workspace. So then every time that I color grade, I can just go into workspaces and click what I want. So for example, this is my main workspace, which I need to update. It's not great. And then click color grading workspace, and that will bring up all the windows in the exact form that you saved it in. So jumping back to this color correction that we made, if I toggle this off and on, you'll notice that the shot was just a little too bright in general. And because the LUT will raise the overall global exposure, we're gonna need to bring that down beforehand so that when the LUT plays a role, it doesn't blow out detail in our shot. So we have the color wheel which pulled it down, and we added the LUT onto the shot. Now our shot is converted to a Rec 709 color space. And you might say, Dylan, this looks kind of gross. Yes, it does. But we will correct that. So we have converted this log footage, and I am next going to add a little bit more contrast and saturation into my image. So I'm gonna open up a color wheels. I'm gonna pull down on my shadows, make sure not to crush my blacks by going below 0 IRE. I may actually raise my midtones because I want this shot to kind of be happy and lively. And then I'm gonna raise my saturation. And now you should be able to tell, what the heck, Dylan, what's going on here? It looks way too warm. If you can't tell this, that's okay. We'll use the scopes, and that will identify for us that this is off balance, that the white balance is off. So let's open up our color curves. The next thing we're gonna do is color correct our shot. It'll allow us to grade other shots on our timeline much easier if they have a same base grade to grade from. So I'm gonna open up my RGB overlay, and I know I have it opened up here, but it's good to see it on this big tall scale, big tall waveform I mean. And we can tell that our shot is off balance by looking at the differentiation in colors here. They're pretty far apart from each other. And I want you to especially watch this section right here. So because it looks like there's way too much red in our image, especially in the highlights right here, let's go to the red curve, and I'm gonna pull down on the red curve. And all that's doing is decreasing the amount of red in my image. And also there's too much green in my shot. This is supposed to be kind of a blue. I think it's supposed to be a blue. So let's go to our green curve, and I'm going to pull that down as well. And I'm kind of going to pull down towards the shadows too. That's too much. You see how that looks too red? Just find that sweet spot. And then I'm going to adjust her skin a little bit more just by pulling down on the midtones. I'm going to push and add a little bit more blue into my shot. I think it looks too green. Wow, yeah, and that looks a lot better. And look at the converging of those colors in the RGB overlay. Okay, so we color balanced, and I'm gonna add just a bit more saturation by going to my Luma curve, which adjusts the brightness of our shot. And I'm going to pull down on my shadows a bit on the darkest part and kind of raise my highlights a tad. But you'll notice that if I go too high, this is kind of a Saving Private Ryan beach bypass look. So I don't want to go too high. I want to go right about there. And I'm going to add some of that saturation that it took out by adding another color wheels. So just raising that a little bit more. And I know this is too much, but we will adjust this in a little bit. Next thing we're going to do is start creating a look. So I'm going to open up my color curves, and I'm going to create what is called a cross-process look, which is an old film technique. And I'm going to do that by starting to introduce those colors that we talked about in the beginning of this video, which was a little bit blue, green, and then kind of some red and pink. So I'm going to change it to aqua, and I'm going to raise the shadows by pulling on this low point here. And then I'm going to do the reverse of the highlights, and that is going to decrease some of the aqua in the highlights. And you'll notice these zebras pop up. And if you didn't tune into the last video, all these zebras is a feature in Final Cut Pro called Range Check. What this does is it lets you know if your highlights are blown out or if your shadows are crushed. And in this instance, it lets us know if our highlights or the brightest parts of our image, which should be white, are overly saturated. And conversely, if the darkest parts of our image are also overly saturated. If you look at the RGB overlay here, you'll say, well, Dylan, you're peaking. And I watched a video from Tyler Stallman, who is a great guy, makes great videos. I think he got this wrong in the fact that he said he uses the RGB overlay to expose, to give proper exposure to his image. And that's not the thing to do because, for example, in this instance, it shows that we're going above 100 IRE, which would mean our image is blowing out. But if we were to pull up our Luma range check, you'll see that we're not. We're fine. And then we can verify that by going to Luma, the Luma waveform, which measures brightness. And you'll see that we are well below 100 IRE. So it's always good to have the Luma waveform up for exposure. And then I use the RGB overlay for color correcting frequently. So let's go back and I'll pull these up because we will adjust this overly saturated whites a little bit later. Okay, so we gave it a look, right? We gave it a look a little bit and it added a little bit more of that cyan back into the image. It gave her skin, actually kind of balanced her skin a little bit more and just helped to make her skin pop from the background. The next step in the cross-process look is doing the same thing with the red, but we are going to invert it. So I'm going to decrease the red in the shadows just by pulling down on this point here. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the highlights, invert it, so I'm going to go up. And that is going to add a little bit more of that red into our highlights, and it decreases the red from our shadows here, which is just going to give it more of a punchier look. And then the last step is to adjust the grains to what you like. So you can lower, you can raise. I am going to just lower a tad, and that kind of brings out some of that red and pink in the highlights and makes it kind of a warmer feel. So this is the look that we added, and now let's start shaping it a little bit more. So I want to accentuate this flower here. I want it to pop. Obviously she is the subject, so I want her to stand out, which we will take care of in a second. But I want this flower to kind of pop as a secondary subject. So I'm going to open up I'm going to open up a color board. And the reason I do that is because there's a bunch of color wheels here. It just makes it easier to know what your color corrections are. I'm going to click on the mask button here and add a color mask. I'm going to start to pull on this color of the flower. And we'll click View Mask. All this does is it will show us the mask so far that we have of this flower. So I'm going to go down to my HSL controls here and start to adjust so that our flower is the thing that is predominantly in the shot and I don't get her skin tones. So this is going to take a little bit of finessing. If you don't know what these are, hue is the color of our image, saturation is the intensity of color in our image, and Luma is the exposure value, no color involved. So I'm going to make sure that it is just the flower, and I think I can get a lot actually with adjusting the Luma value here. And then these smaller sliders here is the feathering. Something that Final Cut Pro doesn't have, and I wish it did, is a blur, which DaVinci Resolve has, but Final Cut doesn't. It would allow us to kind of blur these edges. It makes it look more natural. Okay, let's take a look. So we're kind of getting some of her skin, but that's also because the flower is bouncing and reflecting off of her skin. Let me see if I can kind of adjust that a little bit more. Okay, I can kind of get a little bit. Okay, so I think that's the best we're gonna get. And then all I'm gonna do is head up to my saturation slider, and because I don't want it to look unnatural, I'm gonna take my highlights slider and just raise the saturation of my highlights. So if you notice, if I just crank that and lower that, it just is affecting the brightest parts of this flower. And so I'm gonna bring it, not too much, I'm gonna bring it just about right there. And actually I'm gonna bring up the midtones a tad. So if I turn that off and on, you'll see it just helps it pop a little bit more. Next, let's clean up some of these colors. So open up your hue saturation curves And we'll finally clean up some of this overly saturated highlights, some of these overly saturated highlights. So go down to Luma versus Sat. Luma measures brightness, saturation is the intensity of color, and all we're doing is taking out the intensity of color in the brightest parts of our image. So I use the color picker to select that bright part, and I'm just gonna make a little gradual, I'm gonna make another point and a little gradual drop off here until those zebras go away. So if I turn this off and then click this off and on, you'll notice how much we decrease some of that saturation. And I can make it even a little bit more gradual here just by doing this. There we go. That looks a lot better. So now our whites are white. And conversely, I can do this for the darkest parts of our image as well. So if I click on the color picker and let's go to this shadows, it should pull up right about here. I'll create another anchor point and kind of just lower that to make it a little bit gradual right there. Next thing we're going to do is take out some of the saturation from these bright leaves here. And we can do that by going to Hue versus Sat. Like I talked about last time, all this does is control the intensity of color in whatever color you choose. So let's choose this lime green part, and I'm going to actually extend this a little bit more, delete that point, and I'm gonna lower this down. There we go. You know what? I'm actually, because her skin is maybe a little too much, I'm gonna create another anchor point here and just lower that a tad. There we go. And I'm gonna raise this because I want these columns and these leaves to just have a little bit more saturation. So there, we took out the saturation in our highlights and in our shadows as well. And then we kind of brought back the saturation so she is more of a focus here. But we can make her even more of a focus. And we can do that by adding a shape mask and kind of shaping our light, being essentially cinematographers behind the computer. And so I am going to open up another color wheels, open up a shape mask, and I'm gonna make a long oval shape here. This is the feather slider, so I'm gonna make it just a slight feather, not too much. I'm gonna click outside, and I am going to lower the overall exposure of the outside of the image, and then a little bit more in the shadows. Actually, a little bit more in the midtones a little bit. And then in the inside, I'm gonna raise the midtones a tad. Raise it, and I'm gonna lower the shadows. So she's a little bit brighter, but we still have a little bit of contrast. You see how that just adds more contrast because her eyes are dark and her hair is dark. It just makes it look a little bit more natural, but all the while making her a little bit brighter. And that's kind of a spotlight effect. So let's see what that did if I turn this off and on. And if she's moving, which she kind of is, you will need to keyframe that. So just by clicking this button and then making sure you have that up, you can kind of adjust where that is. So if I just kind of move this slowly over here and right about here. Now there are plugins you can use like Core Melt Slice X, but we will just use this for now. There we go. And it's kind of tracked to her, which is nice. That is the benefit of using DaVinci Resolve, is it has a good tracking feature. So in the shot, we have some nice framing because she is kind of between these two columns and it already kind of guides our eyes in. But to help our eyes kind of be guided in a little bit more, I'm going to shape the light a little bit more by adding 2 shape masks on each side of her and then just feathering the hell out of it. So if I feather this and pull this way past here, and then I'm going to lower the midtones, maybe the overall. Let me lower the highlights a little bit. Okay. Pull that in a little bit. And then I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side by including another shape mask, which will have it on the same color wheel. And then I'm just gonna do that same thing that I just did, kind of rounding it out, adjusting the feather so it's a lot. We'll turn that and kind of push this away. And the reason why I'm not having it be vertical is because this is already so dark. I really just want this area to kind of force your eye to look at her. So let's turn that off and on and see what that did. Okay, so you see how that kind of guides our eye in? It kind of guides our eye into her, so she is the more of the subject of the shot. And we also want to check to make sure her skin is accurate. We want to make sure her skin is the actual color of skin. So add a draw mask to your clip here, and I'm going to select part of her skin. I'm going to actually move around this part because this is the pink light that's reflecting off this flower. I'm going to kind of go down here and just see what that's like. We'll connect that. And pull up your Vectorscope so it's nice and big. If you don't know how to use the Vectorscope, essentially this line is the skin tone line. So no matter what color your skin tone is, it should always fall on this line. And if you don't know about the rest of the scope, you have all of these color values here: red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. And if you were to connect an imaginary line to all of these squares, if your color extends to the line or past the line or even kind of close, it's way too saturated. It's overly saturated. And you can also use this to see if your colors are accurate. If you have like a color picker chart, you can use the Vectorscope. So just by looking at this, her skin is not on the line. We want to swing this a little bit more. So we could use our color wheels and swing the midtones because our skin tones lie in the midtones. But I kind of just want her skin to be affected and not affect all of the midtones as a whole, because I kind of like the look we have going on. So open up another hue saturation curves and I'll use the color picker here. I'll change the color of whatever color I want. So let's pick her skin, and all I'm going to do is swing this just by pulling down or up, depending on where your thing is. And that will kind of put it more on the line. I'm going to raise it a little bit more. There we go. So now if we toggle this off and on, that looks a lot better with that adjustment. Let's pull up our Luma waveform one more time. So go to waveform, and lucky for us, it was already up. And I think her skin is fine. Her skin is falling in about the same exposure value that it should, but now I want to make it a little bit brighter. I want it I want to raise it a tad, and then also raise my highlights. And also you'll notice that my shadows are clipping here, and it's this section right in here. So final correction, go to color wheels, and I'm going to just pull up on my shadows. Let's pull up the range check. I don't know why that wasn't on. So we're good there. And I'm going to bring up my highlights a tad till I see that, those zebras peeking. And boom. The last thing I'm going to do, I think, is shape that light a little bit more. So let's go into that first shape mask we set up. I'm going to click, make sure outside is clicked, and I am going to lower the midtones and the shadows just a little bit, making sure not to go too low on this. And then let's go to those other shape masks that we made. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to lower the midtones and the shadows just a tad and add a little bit more saturation back into those shadows. And let me just adjust this and move that over a little bit more. Last but not least, let's add a little bit of sharpening to just her. So open up your effects browser, go to blur, go down to sharpen, and we'll double click here. And what I'm going to do is click the shape mask once again and make a nice long oval shape to cover just her, and then have a little feathering here. And like I said, if you are using shape masks like this, you may need to adjust the positioning by clicking the keyframe button. Luckily she doesn't move too much, so I don't need to do too much adjusting there, and it looks fine. Okay, I think we've created that split complementary look. Really nice contrast, I think. So let's go over what we did here. So our shot was too bright to begin with, so we lowered the overall global exposure of our shot, and then that helped to help the LUT fit a lot more. And this is the technical LUT that converted the Blackmagic footage to a Rec. 709 color space. We added a little bit more contrast and saturation, and then we color corrected our shot because obviously it was way too green, way too warm. So we took out some of that, added some saturation back into our image, and we started our look. So we wanted that split complementary look. We did so by creating kind of a cross-process look here. And then we started some with kind of the smaller secondary details by adding some saturation in this flower here. We took out the saturation in the bright parts of our image as well as the dark parts. And we also took out some saturation, I believe, in this green here, so it's not too distracting, so our focus is on her. Then we started to shape our light here by adding a shape mask and decreasing the exposure on the outside of the shape mask and increasing the exposure on the inside. Same with these two. This one we shaped it a lot more, so our eyes are kind of pushed in to her since she is the focus. Next thing we did is corrected our skin tones just a tad. We just took out some of that pink and red and added a little bit more of that yellow and orange back into our shot. And the last thing we did was raised our shadows since our shadows were being crushed right over here in this flower, and we just raised that a bit. And then for the final touch, added a bit of sharpening by using a shape mask and having it just affect her. Now, if you have multiple shots of this, obviously you won't be able to keep on some of this shaping of the light, but if you wanted to delete those, so you just have the base correction and the stylized look and stuff, you can do that. Just delete them or delete the ones you want, and then go down to Save Effects preset, name the preset whatever you like, save it in one of these category lists, press save, and then you can just find that in your effects browser. So if you have another clip, find it in your effects, search it, and you can drop it onto those other clips. If you guys enjoyed this, it would mean a lot if you would press the thumbs up button and leave a comment below, because that does help the video do a lot better. And I also want to hear feedback too. So if you guys continued enjoying this series, I'll keep it going, but you have to let me know. Subscribe if you have not already, and hopefully I will see you guys next week. Have a great day.